You remember that feeling, don't you? Sitting on that bench seat, facing the cars behind you, and having a blast making faces at strangers? That was an essential part of my childhood memories, and maybe yours too. And the vehicle tied to those memories was the station wagon. Now, this might sound a little shocking, but America's legendary station wagon is basically dead. When was the last time you saw a brand new, American-branded station wagon in a showroom? It's got to be over a decade, maybe even 2 decades ago, right? The last American full-size wagons, the Chevrolet Caprice and Buick Roadmaster, stopped production in 1996. It's hard to believe, isn't it? In just about 20 years, we went from a time when Americans had 62 station wagon models to choose from in 1976, down to 0 American-made wagons. A quiet disappearance. The car, once considered an icon of the American dream, the versatile vehicle that took suburban families everywhere, from the soccer field and school to camping trips. Where did it go? Why did it vanish from American roads? That's the story we've explored together today. Let's rewind the clock and go back to the very first days of this great car. The story of the station wagon begins in a very different America. Go back to the early 1900s, when trains were the main way to travel between cities. And the name station wagon actually came from that. These cars were literally wagons serving train stations. Initially, they were called depot hacks. The word hack here meant taxi, and they operated mainly around depots or train stations. Picture this. You just stepped off the train in 1910 with a mountain of luggage. No Uber, no modern taxis. You needed something big enough to haul both you and all your stuff from the train station to wherever you needed to go. That's where the depot hack came in. Basically, they were modified truck chassis, with some bench seats added for passengers and a spacious area in the back for luggage. The first real breakthrough, not surprisingly, came from Henry Ford. In 1910, Ford started selling a bare chassis of the Model T for $700. Ford didn't build the station wagons themselves, though. They just provided the mechanical parts. Hundreds of small companies across America would buy this chassis and build their own custom wooden bodies on them. Can you imagine? In 1909, there were 551 car manufacturers in the US. Now we're down to about 3 giants. The transition from depot hack to station wagon happened between 1923 and 1929. Nobody knows exactly when, but by 1929, when the first station wagon from one of America's Big Three was born, that was the Ford Model A, the name station wagon was already sticking. But the real turning point happened in 1935. Chevrolet did something nobody had tried before. They built a station wagon that was entirely made of steel. Goodbye wood. Well, not entirely. Strangely, it wasn't immediately popular. People actually preferred the wooden look. It made wagons look expensive, even a status symbol. In the 1930s and early 1940s, woody wagons even sold for more than standard cars and signified prestige. Ford wasn't far behind. In 1936, they opened their own wagon body plant in Iron Mountain, Michigan. This plant used wood from Ford's own vast forests near Lake Superior. Ford literally owned the forests to build their car bodies. They shipped complete wooden wagon bodies to assembly plants across North America. But the woody wagon had a secret, not a very pleasant one. They were a pain to maintain. The wood required constant care. You had to oil it regularly, check for rot, make sure the joints were tight. Imagine having to refinish your car like a piece of furniture every year. Too much work, right? That's what eventually led to the all-steel wagon. The real breakthrough came after World War II. In 1946, Willys, yes, the company that made Jeeps, introduced something revolutionary. The 1946 Willys Jeep station wagon was the first mass-produced, all-steel, family-sized wagon. although the sides still had a fake wood grain look. They kept the painted wood grain because people still associated wood with quality and luxury, but structurally, it was all steel. By 1949, the writing was on the wall for real wood. Plymouth introduced the Suburban. It was a great-looking all-steel wagon that didn't require you to be an amateur carpenter. After the Plymouth Suburban came out in 1949, genuine wood-bodied wagons went out of production completely. Sure, a few companies still used real wood trim until the mid-1950s, but after that, it was all fake stuff, vinyl graphics pretending to be wood. Which, when you think about it, isn't that a perfect metaphor for the changing America? For the gearheads out there, what's your all-time favorite station wagon? Could be American, European, Japanese, whatever. Which wagon do you think represents the best of what this body style could be? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now we get to the good stuff, the golden age of the station wagon. To understand why station wagons became so popular, you have to know what was happening in America after World War II. It was the birth of the suburbs, the interstate highway system, and of course, the baby boom. Suddenly, millions of Americans needed a car big enough for a larger family, for longer trips, and all the stuff that came with that new American lifestyle. The 1950s were when things really exploded. Station wagons did too, going from less than 3% of total U.S. car production in 1950 to almost 17% of the market by the end of the decade. Think about that. In just 10 years, wagons went from a niche product to almost 1 out of every 5 cars sold. And in 1958, something remarkable happened. Within Plymouth's lineup, the best-selling body style was the station wagon. Not the sedan, not the coupe, the wagon. What made them special in this era? First of all, they were absolutely massive. We're talking about land yachts here. These weren't just cars, they were mobile living rooms. Take the 1968 Ford Country Squire, for example. This car was over 218 inches long. That's over 18 feet. For comparison, a modern Chevy Tahoe is only about 210 inches long. Yeah, your big SUV is smaller than Grandpa's wagon. But it wasn't just about size. These wagons represented something bigger. They were symbols of the American dream. Americans wanted it all, or at least a lot more than they had during the tough 30s and the war years. And the station wagon delivered. It was the first versatile vehicle that could handle their expanding horizons. A big family, a suburban home, hobbies, recreation, and even status. The variety was incredible. Remember I said there were 62 wagon models in 1976? Think about what that actually means. You had 2-door wagons, 4-door wagons, wagons with pillars, pillarless wagons called hardtops, 2-row wagons, 3-row wagons. Some had the 3rd row facing backwards, some had side-facing jump seats. Even the tailgates were engineering marvels. Some opened like regular doors, some folded down like a truck tailgate, and GM even invented the so-called clamshell design, where the tailgate completely disappeared when opened. The 1960s brought even more innovations. This was the era of the Vista Cruiser, with its raised roof and skylights. That's right, panoramic roofs weren't a new idea. Buick and Oldsmobile were putting glass panels in their wagon roofs back in the 60s. You had small wagons like the Ford Falcon, mid-size wagons, and of course the full-size Giants that could comfortably seat 9 people. Well, comfortably if you didn't mind rubbing shoulders with your siblings, that is. Let me talk about the cultural impact of these cars. In the 1960s and early 70s, if you were a middle-class American family, chances are you owned a station wagon. It just seemed like the obvious thing to do. They weren't just transportation. They were the mobile headquarters of the American family. Soccer practice, grocery runs, camping trips, driving to grandma's house 3 states away. The wagon did it all. And the marketing? It was something else. Ford called their top-of-the-line wagons the Country Squire to make you feel like a landed gentry. Chrysler had the Town and Country. Get it? It could handle both city driving and weekend getaways. Every manufacturer had its own wood grain trim package, even though by the 1960s it was all fake vinyl. But people loved it. That fake wood said, "I've made it," louder than any chrome badge. The performance wasn't bad either. These wagons weren't just for hauling groceries. By the late 1960s, you could buy a station wagon with a huge V8 engine, putting out respectable power. Some even had 400-plus cubic-inch engines. Sure, they got about 8 miles to the gallon. But gas was cheap, and America was at its peak. What could possibly go wrong? So, do you remember riding in a station wagon as a kid? What model was it? I'm really curious to hear your wagon memories. Now, we need to talk about numbers. I know some of you are thinking, oh no, not finances. But bear with me for a bit, because this is where the story gets really interesting. On the surface, the station wagon business looked great well into the early 1970s. Sales were strong, profits were good, and Detroit was churning out wagons as fast as they could. But there were warning signs, if you knew where to look. Let me explain this like I'm pitching to investors. When you run a business, you want to keep your costs low and your selling price high. Pretty simple, right? The problem with station wagons was that they were expensive to build. You had all the mechanical parts of a regular car. Plus, you needed a longer chassis, a bigger roof, more glass, more seats, heavier duty suspension to handle all that cargo. But here's the key thing. You couldn't charge that much more for them. Back in 1970, when wagon sales peaked at 972,212 units sold, accounting for 10% of total car sales, the big three were making decent money on each one, but not a huge profit. The actual profit on a sedan was better because they were simpler to manufacture. But as long as the volume was high, things were okay. Then, October 1973 happened. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OAPEC, declared a total oil embargo. If you didn't live through that time, it's hard to explain how crazy things got. The price of oil almost tripled, from $3 a barrel to almost $12 a barrel globally. Imagine waking up tomorrow and gasoline is 4 times more expensive than it is today. That's what Americans faced. The impact was swift and brutal. Drivers started lining up at gas stations starting in the summer of 1972, and it got even worse in the summer of 1973. People would wait for hours just to get gas, and when they got to the pump, they were limited to 10 gallons or less. Some stations even had odd, even rationing based on the last digit of your license plate. It was chaos. Now, you might think, well, that affected all cars the same, right? Wrong. Station wagons were particularly vulnerable because they were gas guzzlers. We're talking about cars that got maybe 10 to 12 miles to the gallon on a good day. When gas prices quadrupled and you could barely find gas, suddenly that big wagon in your garage didn't look like the American dream anymore. It looked like a liability. The sales numbers tell the story. After peaking at almost 1 million units in 1970, wagon sales started to slide. And by 1974 and 1975, they were in freefall. Station wagon sales, especially full-size wagons, dropped significantly between 1974 and 1975. Chrysler saw this first. They completely stopped building their full-size wagons in 1978. Think about that. One of the big three just said, "Nope, we're out," and completely exited the full-size wagon market. But wait, it gets worse. Wagons weren't just fuel-thirsty. They were expensive to build, and the auto industry was facing new challenges. The introduction of new emission standards in 1972 meant manufacturers had to spend millions redesigning engines. Those big, powerful V8 engines that were the heart of these wagons had to be neutered to meet emissions, which made them even less fuel efficient. So, by the late 1970s, the station wagon was in trouble. But honestly, the gas crisis and emissions standards were just the beginning. The real killer was coming, and it came from an unlikely place: Chrysler, the same company that just bailed on full-size wagons. Lee Iacocca had just taken over Chrysler, and the company was in deep trouble. They needed something revolutionary, not evolutionary. And in 1984, they launched it. The minivan, the Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager, changed everything. Minivans did the family hauling job better than station wagons and were more affordable. Think about what made minivans brilliant. They had more interior space than a wagon, but were shorter overall. They had sliding doors, which made picking up kids in a parking lot so much easier. They sat higher, giving the driver a better view. They were built on a car platform, so they drove better than a van, but carried more than a wagon. It was genius. But there was another factor that people don't really talk about as much: image. By the 1980s, the station wagon was seen as incredibly uncool. It was associated with boring suburbanites, with conformity, with everything square about the 1950s and 60s. If you were a baby boomer who grew up in the back seat of your parents' country Squire, the last thing you wanted was to buy one yourself. You wanted something different, something that said you weren't your parents. The minivan was different enough to feel fresh, but that was just the first blow. The real knockout punch came from Japan, and it was wearing hiking boots. I'm talking about the SUV revolution, and specifically cars like the Jeep Cherokee, which came out in 1984. SUVs existed before: the Suburban, the Wagoner, the Bronco. But they were truck-based vehicles that drove like trucks. The Cherokee was different. It was smaller. It had 4 doors. It had a modern design. And most importantly, it was marketed as a lifestyle vehicle. You weren't just buying a truck. You were buying an image of outdoor adventure and off-road capability. Then came the Toyota 4Runner in 1984, the Pathfinder in 1986, the Explorer in 1990. Each one took another bite out of the wagon market. By the early 1990s, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was in neon lights. The few remaining American wagon manufacturers were losing serious money on every car sold. Look at the total collapse. Wagons stayed popular through the 1970s, but after that, the decline was rapid. By 2004, there were only 26 wagon models available, including 2 from Ford, 1 from Chrysler, and 1 from General Motors. By 2016, there were just 8. The last gasps were particularly sad. The Ford Taurus wagon, discontinued in 2005. The Focus wagon, gone in 2008. GM hung on the longest with the Caprice and Roadmaster, but even they gave up in 1996. The final indignity: many of these last wagons were just rebadged versions of each other. The Caprice, Roadmaster, and Olds Custom Cruiser were basically the same car with different grills. It was like watching a former boxing champion who could barely stand but refused to fall. Did your family have a classic country Squire with the wood paneling? Or maybe a Volvo wagon for safety? Or were you one of the lucky kids who got to ride in a Vista Cruiser with the glass roof? Share your memories with us. The perfect storm and what's left. What really sealed the wagon's fate was a perfect storm of factors. First, CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy, made it hard for manufacturers to justify building big, gas-guzzling wagons. But here's the crazy part. Trucks and SUVs had different, looser standards, so manufacturers could build a Suburban that got worse mileage than a Caprice wagon, but face less regulatory pressure. Talk about a twisted incentive. Second, the profits on SUVs were insane. An Explorer might cost maybe $1,000 more to build than a Taurus wagon, but sold for $5,000 to $10,000 more. If you're running a car company and can only build a certain number of vehicles, which one are you going to build? Third, and this one really annoys me, Americans convinced themselves they needed SUVs for safety and off-road capability, even though 99% of them never went off-road. And the safety advantage was mostly just because they were bigger than other cars. We traded practicality for perception, and the wagon paid the price. So, where are we today? Believe it or not, the station wagon isn't completely dead in America. It's more like it's in a coma, with European doctors trying to keep it alive. European automakers like Audi, Volvo, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz still offer station wagons in their North American lineups, though they call them by different names like Avant, Touring, and Estate, because apparently, station wagon is a dirty word now. The numbers are pretty sad. In 2015, U.S. station wagon sales only accounted for 1.1% of the total domestic car market. That's 188,959 wagons sold that year, less than Ford sells F-150s in 2 months. But here's the really interesting and kind of ironic thing. Remember I said SUVs killed the wagon? Well, now we have something called crossovers, which are basically just wagons with a lift kit. Think about it. What's a Honda CR-V or a Toyota RAV4 if not a taller wagon? They're built on a car platform. They have a rear hatch. They carry 5 to 7 people. The only difference is they sit a few inches higher and have some plastic cladding around the wheel wells. Subaru Outback figured this out first. When it came out in 1994, it was literally a lifted legacy wagon with some rugged styling cues. But Subaru was smart. They marketed it as something new, not a wagon. And it worked. The Outback is one of Subaru's best-selling models, proof that Americans will still buy wagons, as long as you don't call them wagons. There have been a few attempts to revive the wagon. Cadillac tried with the CTS Sport Wagon from 2010 to 2014. It was beautiful. It drove great, had a powerful V8 option, and it sold about as well as ice cream in Antarctica. BMW only sold 405 Series Tourings in 2009 before giving up. The most recent casualty was the Buick Regal Tour X. It lasted from 2018 to 2020. Just 2 years, that's all. And this was a great car. Comfortable, practical, good-looking, reasonably priced. But Americans looked at it and said, "Nah, I'll buy the Enclave instead," which is basically the same car, but taller and gets worse gas mileage. What would it take for the wagon to really come back? Honestly, I think the moment has passed. America's infrastructure is built around SUVs and crossovers now. Parking spaces are designed for them now. Drive-thrus are elevated for them now. And most importantly, Americans' self-image is tied to them. We've convinced ourselves that we need to sit high, need a command driving position, that we might suddenly need to drive through a river on the way to soccer practice. The only way I see wagons coming back is if gas prices skyrocket to $10 a gallon and stay there, or if there's a massive cultural shift where efficiency becomes cool again. But even then, we'll probably just make smaller SUVs, rather than admit that wagons make more sense. That's how stubborn we are. The emotional legacy and the lessons learned. I never really got to experience the golden age of the station wagon. By the time I was born, they were already fading. But I still remember seeing the few stragglers left, maybe an old beat-up Taurus wagon in the supermarket parking lot, or somebody's ancient Volvo 240 wagon that just refused to die. And every time I saw one, it felt like spotting an endangered species. What made wagons special? It wasn't their fuel economy, terrible. It wasn't their handling, like driving a couch, or even their looks. Let's be honest, most were pretty ugly. It was what they represented. They were the ultimate family car in an era when family meant something very specific. Dad, mom, 2.5 kids, and a dog named Spot. The wagon was where life happened, where kids fought with their siblings on the way to grandma's house, where families learned geography by playing license plate bingo on cross-country road trips, where kids got their first taste of freedom sitting in the backwards-facing way back, making faces at the cars behind them. No seatbelts, no airbags, just them and an eighth of an inch of safety glass separating them from the freeway. Part of me is surprised they still exist in any form. These cars were a testament to the optimism of America. Who else would build a car that got 10 miles to the gallon during an oil crisis? Who else would put a backwards-facing third-row seat in just for fun? Who else would stick fake wood on the side and think, yeah, that looks good? Only us. But here's what we lost when the wagon went away: practicality. Yes, I know your crossover is practical, but can you haul a 4x8 sheet of plywood in it? Can you sleep in the back on a camping trip? Can you haul 9 people and their luggage? A proper wagon could do all that and still cost less than a modern crossover. We also lost character. Every wagon was different. You had the sport wagons trying to be cool, the luxury wagons with leather and chrome, the basic wagons that were just honest transportation. Now every crossover looks the same, like somebody inflated a sedan and added plastic cladding. Where's the personality in that? The decline of the station wagon teaches us an important lesson about American consumer culture. We don't always buy what's logical. We buy what makes us feel good about ourselves. SUVs and crossovers make people feel safe, capable, and adventurous, even if they never leave the suburbs. Wagons made people feel practical. And who wants to feel practical? It also shows how quickly things can change. In one generation, the wagon went from 17% of the market to virtually nothing. The same thing could happen to SUVs if the right combination of factors comes along. Maybe it's electric vehicles. Maybe it's autonomous vehicles. Maybe it's something we haven't even thought of yet. But the one constant is change. There's also a lesson about unintended consequences. CAFE standards were supposed to make cars more efficient, but they just pushed people into trucks and SUVs. Safety regulations made cars heavier, which made them less efficient. Every solution creates new problems. It's like we're playing whack-a-mole. But perhaps the biggest lesson is about loss. We lost something when the wagon disappeared. A connection to a simpler time, a more optimistic America. A world where the family car was just that. A car for the family. Not a statement, not a lifestyle choice. Just honest transportation that did what you needed it to do. What do you think really killed the wagon? Do you agree with my theory that it was a combination of the gas crisis, minivans, and SUVs? Or do you think there was more to it? Maybe the wagon was always destined to disappear, and it just took us a while to catch up. And here's a question I really want you to think about. Do you remember having station wagons as an option? Or do you just think crossovers and SUVs are simply better? Because honestly, I'm still torn. My head knows that modern vehicles are safer, more efficient, and more capable. But my heart misses those long, low wagons with the ridiculous fake wood and the backwards-facing seat. I'm also curious, would you buy a wagon today if they made them? And I mean a real wagon, not a lifted Outback or a Mercedes E-Class that costs more than a house. Something like a modern country Squire with 3 rows, a big V8 engine, or maybe a hybrid setup for the new age. And yes, include the fake wood paneling. Is there an audience for that, or are we just too far gone from that era? And finally, what do you think the future holds? Will the wagon ever make a comeback in America? Or are we just going to keep driving taller and taller vehicles until we're all in monster trucks? Is there any hope for those of us who think lower is better and wagons are awesome? Any other thoughts on station wagons? Leave them in the comments section. Top 20 worst cars of all time. Perhaps in life, each of us has a car tied to a memory, right? Dad's car, Grandpa's, the first car we drove ourselves, or simply the car we dreamed of. The world of cars is truly diverse and colorful, but alongside amazing machines that have become legends, history also marks some stumbles, models that make people shake their heads, or even become the laughingstock of their era. Today, let's revisit the 20 cars considered the worst of all time. Maybe you've seen them, heard of them, or even had not-so-pleasant memories with one of them. Let's begin this special journey. Chevrolet SSR. Starting our list at number 20 is a car that even Chevy enthusiasts have to admit was a mistake. That's the Chevrolet SSR. Appearing in the early 2000s, this car was a rather strange attempt by GM to combine the power of a pickup with the sporty look of a hot rod convertible. Looking back, it looked pretty unique, didn't it? It had a unique retro style, reminiscent of classic pickups, but with a modern body and a retractable convertible top. This was a bold idea, trying to create an entirely new vehicle segment, a hybrid of a pickup, sports car, and convertible. However, unfortunately, this idea didn't go as planned. Sources called it heavy, underpowered, and slow. Although later versions were equipped with a more powerful V8 engine, the initial version was still criticized for its performance. Its heavy weight overshadowed the engine's power, making acceleration and handling not meet the expectations for a sporty-looking vehicle. Its styling, while initially unique, was considered awkward and controversial. The hybrid look wasn't popular with the majority, making it the subject of much discussion, not in a positive way. Despite having an interior considered quite luxurious, this wasn't enough to save its other weaknesses. The SSR still didn't sell as expected, with only fewer than 10,000 units per year. Low sales indicated the market didn't really embrace this combination idea. Some critics even considered it pointless, questioning the purpose of such a car's existence. Ultimately, it went down in history as an unsuccessful experiment by Chevy, a reminder that sometimes ideas that are too unique and blend too many elements may not be the formula for success. BMW Isetta. Looking at cute tiny microcars like the 1955 BMW Isetta, you might find them adorable, but perhaps they should only be admired in a museum. These cars are too small, to the point where they could be mistaken for bumper cars at an amusement park. This extremely compact size brings serious safety issues. It means that any accident, even at low speeds, can cause a disaster for the occupants due to the lack of crumple zones and protective frame. The Isetta also had unique but impractical design features. It didn't have reverse gear, causing significant difficulty when needing to back up in tight spaces. The most distinctive feature was having only a single door at the front, which opened along with the entire steering column and dashboard. This meant that if you parked the car close to an obstacle in front, such as a wall or another car, you couldn't get out or back up. Furthermore, it only had 3 wheels. Some versions had 4 wheels but were very narrow at the rear, significantly reducing the car's stability, especially when cornering or encountering strong winds. This car was produced by BMW, a company that initially made refrigerators and small trucks before focusing on cars. Edmunds.com ranked the Isetta as the 62nd worst car in history. Although the Isetta helped BMW survive after the war, it remains a symbol of the limitations and inconvenience of microcars. Hummer H2. In the early 2000s, the trend of large, imposing vehicles boomed in the US, and the Hummer H2, launched in 2002, was a symbol of that era. This was a civilian version of a military vehicle, the Humvee. The H2 had a very large and attention-grabbing appearance, conveying a sense of strength and dominance. However, it was quickly criticized for its terrible fuel economy. With a large V8 engine and heavy weight, the H2's gas mileage was extremely poor, unsuitable for daily driving. It also lacked practicality for daily driving due to its bulky size, difficulty parking, and limited visibility. The H2 was considered a symbol of excessive consumption and environmental insensitivity. Amid growing environmental concerns and rising fuel prices, the image of a car drinking gas like water became negative. Although it had good off-road capability, inherited from its military roots, the H2's interior was rated as cramped relative to its exterior size and used cheap materials. The discrepancy between the imposing exterior and the less than luxurious, cramped interior disappointed consumers. It was considered too big, too militaristic, openly contemptuous of the common good. The failure in image and sales, after the initial boom period, of the Hummer H2 caused significant financial losses for GM and ultimately led to the discontinuation of the Hummer brand. Eagle Premier.
Best domestic four-door sedan in America. Next to new Eagle Premier, the competition just fades away.
The Eagle Premier was the product of a collaboration between American Motors, AMC, an American automaker, and the French brand Renault, before Chrysler acquired AMC in 1987. Initially, this car received some positive reviews. It was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro of Ital Design, a famous designer, and had a modern styling at the time. The car's interior was said to be quite luxurious, providing a more upscale feel compared to American models in the same segment. However, the Premier also had many weaknesses. One of the controversial design features was the gear shifter placement on the dashboard, a rather strange position unfamiliar to traditional drivers. The car was rated as having high fuel consumption compared to its contemporaries, which wasn't favored in a market increasingly concerned with fuel efficiency. The dashboard itself didn't always work smoothly, experiencing reliability issues with the electrical system and indicators. Although the Eagle Premier was the technical basis for successful later Chrysler LH models like the Dodge Intrepid and Chrysler Concorde, it was a commercial failure itself. Sales did not meet expectations, and the Eagle brand did not last long under Chrysler. The Premier was judged to lack identity and be boring, failing to make its own mark in the competitive market. TheStreet.com even called it the worst car of all time, describing it as a symbol of indifference and pointlessness. Ford Edsel Corsair, 1958. The name Edsel has long been synonymous with failure in the American auto industry. Although Ford invested $400 million, a huge sum in the 1950s, and heavily promoted this new brand, the result was a commercial disaster. The 1958 Edsel Corsair was part of that sad story. The Edsel was expected to help Ford compete better with GM and Chrysler brands in the mid-range segment. But in reality, they were just Mercury models, another Ford brand, disguised with some styling changes and sold at a higher price. This made customers feel they weren't getting a truly new or worthwhile product for their money. This car was launched at an unfavorable time. The US was experiencing an economic recession, which significantly reduced demand for expensive mid-size cars. Ford misjudged the market. Although the Edsel wasn't technically a bad car, it was a major marketing failure. The advertising campaign created overly high expectations that the actual product couldn't meet. The car also didn't meet customer expectations for distinctiveness and value. Additionally, the Edsel also suffered from build quality issues in its initial models. The most mocked feature was the front grille. It was compared to unsightly images, like a toilet or female genitalia. This shows the lack of refinement in the design and its strong ability to make a negative impression on the public. The failure of the Edsel caused significant financial losses for Ford and led to the bankruptcy of many dealerships that had invested in the brand. The Edsel is an expensive lesson in market research, product positioning, and design. Ford Pinto. The Ford Pinto, launched in 1971, was a compact car that sold quite well in the US, competing with imported small cars. However, its reputation was permanently ruined by a serious safety issue. The Pinto's fuel tank was placed in a position at high risk of being punctured and catching fire when hit from behind, even at low speeds. This design was said to be to save production costs. The infamous Pinto Memo showed that Ford executives knew about this risk, but decided not to fix it. This was because they calculated that paying compensation for accident and fatality lawsuits would be cheaper than recalling and repairing millions of cars. This, when revealed, caused great public outrage and led to many costly lawsuits. Although the Pinto's engine was quite reliable and affordable, the image of burning Pintos was deeply ingrained in people's minds, associated with Ford's disregard for human life safety. Reliant Robin. In the UK, the Reliant Robin is a fairly familiar name. This is a small car with only 3 wheels. Although it was quite popular at the time, partly thanks to tax regulations and driving licenses, it could be driven with a motorcycle license in some cases. It quickly also became a laughingstock and was often called a 3-wheeled death trap. The 3 wheels, with 1 wheel at the front and 2 at the rear, made it extremely unstable, especially when cornering or encountering side winds. It's common to see images of Reliant Robins tipping or flipping over in TV shows or funny video clips, but in reality, this is a serious safety issue. The car's exterior was made of fiberglass, a lightweight material that provided only minimal protection in an accident. The car was described as fragile, easy to tip over. Despite being famous for its uniqueness and humor, thanks to TV appearances, the Reliant Robin consistently appears on lists of the worst cars due to its inherent design and safety flaws. It's proof that sometimes uniqueness comes with unacceptable risks. Maserati Biturbo. We come to a luxury Italian car brand where an attempt at modernization ran into serious problems. The turbulent 1970s with the energy crisis forced many sports car companies to change. So did Maserati. They shifted focus from pure speed to performance, luxury, and more comfort. The Maserati Biturbo, launched in the early 1980s with its new twin-turbo engine, drew attention for its modern technology at the time. However, its first generation encountered serious issues. This car quickly became known as an unreliable heap of junk. Customers constantly experienced breakdowns, and the car required continuous, expensive maintenance. Common problems included fuel leaks, electrical failures, a classic issue with many Italian models of that era, water pump failures, transmission oil leaks, leaks from seals. Even the fuse box melted, a clear sign of poor assembly quality. The coolant temperature warning light often turned on even when the engine wasn't overheating, confusing drivers. The build quality of the first-generation bi-turbo was described as approximate, a polite way of saying careless assembly and non-durable materials. Although there were improvements in later versions and successor models, the reputation of the first-generation bi-turbo was severely damaged. It became a symbol of unreliability and high running costs, significantly affecting Maserati's image in the public eye. Saturn Ion. Let's talk about a brand that once promised something different, but ended in disappointment. Perhaps many still remember the Saturn brand with its promise of a different car buying experience, with no haggling. However, the Saturn Ion, launched in the early 2000s, became a big disappointment. This was one of the last models from Saturn before the brand faded away, and it seems to have contributed to that collapse. The Ion was criticized for poor build quality. Interior and exterior parts were loosely assembled, giving a cheap feel. The interior was described as awful, using hard, unappealing plastic materials lacking refinement. The overall design of the car was also not attractive, lacking personality and looking quite ordinary. The cheap plastic exterior was a major drawback, not just in feel, but also in durability. The car's handling was also poor, providing an uncertain driving feel and lacking connection to the road surface. More seriously, it was linked to safety issues, with a series of recalls. The most notable was the faulty ignition switch, a serious problem that caused fatalities and was one of GM's major scandals. Sources called it boring, a car lacking highlights and failing to evoke positive emotions. It was even said to haunt former owners with the troubles it brought. Some unusual design details, like the instrument panel placed in the center instead of in front of the driver, were also criticized for making it difficult to monitor driving information. Overall, the Saturn Ion is a typical example of how excessive cost-cutting led to a low-quality, unsafe, and failed product in the market. Pontiac Aztek. Perhaps you remember this car from the show Breaking Bad, right? The Pontiac Aztek, launched in 2001, is one of the most intensely controversial cars in terms of appearance. Many consider it one of the ugliest cars ever made. Sources describe it with unflattering images, a weird three-eyed monster, or a mid-size SUV that looks like a combination of a minivan and a station wagon. This design was the result of an attempt to reconcile many different ideas, trying to create a versatile vehicle, but ultimately resulting in an unsightly shape. Even Consumer Reports staff were reluctant to drive it during the day, showing the level of its weirdness in the public eye. Although some tried to defend the Aztek, saying it had spacious usability, it was quite versatile inside with features like an integrated camping tent or a cooler, and some good technical aspects, its design was the most heavily criticized point. It was called awkward, unattractive, and looked like an angry kitchen appliance. The Aztek may have been ahead of its time in some aspects of versatile design, but its failure, primarily due to its unaccepted appearance, contributed to the demise of the Pontiac brand. Thank you for watching. To continue with more content, comment yes to let us know you're still following. Ford Mustang II. When people think of the Ford Mustang, they usually imagine powerful and attractive muscle cars. However, the second generation is a completely different story. The second generation, the Ford Mustang II, is considered a disgrace to the lineage. This car was born in the mid-1970s, a challenging time for the auto industry. It was during the energy crisis, and new emissions regulations limited engine performance. The Mustang II was designed to be more fuel efficient to meet market demand amid rising gas prices. However, to do that, Ford reduced quality as well. One of the most controversial decisions was that it was built on the platform of the Ford Pinto, another model with a bad reputation for quality and safety. We'll talk about the Pinto later in this list. Using the platform of a small, cheap car lost the powerful pony car essence of the original Mustang. The Mustang II was rated as having poor handling and a weak engine. The engines had small displacement and low power, not providing the sporty driving feel expected from a Mustang. Build quality was also a big problem. Although it sold well and was initially well received, possibly due to the demand for fuel-efficient cars at the time, today it is heavily criticized. Mustang enthusiasts consider it a terrible car, an anomaly in the glorious history of the lineage. Even its win of the 1974 Motor Trend Car of the Year award is considered embarrassing, showing the difference between initial perception and historical view. Cadillac Cimarron. In the 1980s, European luxury brands like BMW and Mercedes-Benz were very successful with compact premium models. Cadillac, America's leading luxury brand, felt the pressure and rushed to introduce the Cimarron as an attempt to compete in this emerging segment. However, this turned out to be a big mistake. The Cimarron was essentially just a Chevrolet Cavalier dressed up and sold at twice the price. The Cavalier was a common, inexpensive model from Chevrolet. Cadillac's mere act of adding a few trim pieces, leather seats, and a Cadillac logo to a basic platform was considered a blatant insult to Cadillac's illustrious name and luxury tradition. This car had poor build quality, inheriting many problems from the Cavalier platform. Performance was terrible, with a weak engine and poor handling, completely unworthy of a car wearing the luxury badge. The Cimarron's appearance was also very boring, lacking any distinctive features or luxury. Even GM engineers hated working on it, perhaps because they understood the car's disguised nature. Forbes called it a legendary failure, a classic example of lazy platform reuse. The Cimarron's failure seriously damaged Cadillac's reputation. It took the brand a long time to regain customer and expert trust after the stumble of the Cimarron. Chevrolet Vega. In the 1970s, when imported cars from Japan and other countries began to compete strongly in the US with compact, fuel-efficient models, GM introduced the Chevrolet Vega as a small, affordable car to compete. Initially, the Vega was praised and sold very well, even winning the 1971 Motor Trend Car of the Year award. However, the joy didn't last long. It quickly revealed serious issues with quality and reliability. Its aluminum block engine was particularly prone to premature failure, often overheating and having piston ring problems. General Motors had difficulty manufacturing aluminum engines with consistent quality at scale at the time. This car was also very prone to rust, especially when transported vertically on special rail cars, Verta-Pack, where it wasn't properly protected from the weather. The Vega was called a rusty heap of junk and seemed to spend more time in repair shops than on the road. There were large-scale recalls and safety issues, severely eroding customer trust. The Vega's failure seriously damaged the reputations of Chevrolet and GM, becoming one of the classic examples of how American automakers struggled to compete on quality and reliability with Japanese rivals at that time. The Vega is a warning about the consequences of launching an unfinished product onto the market. Chrysler PT Cruiser. Here we have a car with a retro design style that went spectacularly wrong. Retro design can look great when done right, like the Fiat 500, for example. But the Chrysler PT Cruiser is an example of how it can go tragically off course. Appearing in the late 1990s, this was Chrysler's effort during a time of financial difficulties and its partnership with Mercedes. The PT Cruiser was initially launched with a 5-door hatchback dark wagon style inspired by cars from the 1930s to 1950s. However, it was quickly deemed to have an awkward appearance. This design was controversial, unpopular with the majority, and quickly became outdated. The convertible version was particularly heavily criticized. Sources called it a very ugly thing to look at. Cutting off the roof damaged the original body structure. Not just in appearance, the convertible version was even more heavily criticized for its engineering. Cutting off the roof also made it lack structural rigidity, making an already poor driving experience even worse. The body twisted when going over rough roads, seriously affecting handling and comfort. The interior wasn't much better. It used too much cheap and brittle plastic, giving a feeling of sitting in a toy from a Happy Meal. Poor material quality and an unrefined interior design significantly reduced the overall sense of quality. The 2005 convertible model was ranked 16th on Edmunds.com's list of the 100 worst cars of all time, a sad position for a model that was expected to make a difference. Are there any cars on this list that you once owned, drove, or have a special story about? Please share your memories and thoughts in the comments below. Yugo. The Yugo, imported into the US from Yugoslavia in the mid-1880s, was advertised as the cheapest car on the market. The extremely low price was its main attraction. However, it quickly became known for extremely poor build quality and unreliability. Sources described it as a bag of nuts and bolts loosely assembled, implying that parts were put together hastily and poorly. The engine often had problems, difficult to start or running erratically. The electrical system was prone to failure, causing many troubles. And one of the most common stories about the Yugo was that parts could simply fall off while driving, from windshield wipers to door handles. The driving experience was described as rough and uncomfortable, with poor steering and handling, making the car difficult and unsafe to control. The Yugo became a common joke in comedy shows, movies, and popular culture, a classic example of "you get what you pay for." Consumer Reports, a reputable product review magazine, even recommended buying a good used car instead of a new Yugo. It's often called the worst car ever sold to the American public. Trabant. The Trabant is a symbol of the old East German auto industry. It was launched in the late 1950s as an attempt to replace the Volkswagen Beetle in Eastern Europe. However, the Trabant became known for its outdated and inefficient two-stroke engine. This engine produced thick smoke and was underpowered, causing pollution and not meeting the standards of more modern cars. It was considered unreliable. Technical problems occurred frequently. Sources even said that body panels could fall off at high speeds, an alarming sign of poor assembly quality and materials. More importantly, it lacked basic safety features like turn signals or brake lights in the early versions, which was unacceptable for a car on the road. Although improved over the years and having some nostalgic fans, the Trabant is still considered the car that shamed communism and a hollow lie made of worthless recycled material. Having to wait many years to buy a new Trabant was also a negative point, reflecting the inefficiency of the planned economy. AMC Pacer. AMC is often known for bold ideas, sometimes going against the mainstream. The AMC Pacer, launched in the mid-1970s, is a prime example. It was designed with the goal of maximizing interior space and comfort, especially cabin width, making it look very wide relative to its length. The Pacer's distinctive feature was its very large glass area, accounting for up to 37% of the body surface, with the passenger side door larger than the driver's side door for easier access to the rear seat. However, the Pacer's styling was considered odd and controversial from its launch. It was nicknamed the Mobile Fishbowl, or a glass globe, due to its huge glass area and round, unbalanced shape. In the summer months, this car became extremely hot inside due to the greenhouse effect from the large amount of glass. Although the Pacer had some advantages like fuel economy in the context of the energy crisis and spacious interior, its straight-six engine was considered outdated even in 1975, when competitors had moved to more modern V6 engines. This affected the car's performance and fuel consumption. DMC DeLorean. Thanks to the Back to the Future movie, the DMC DeLorean has become a cultural icon. With its sleek stainless steel design and distinctive gull-wing doors, opening upwards like a seagull's wings, it had an incredibly impressive and unique appearance that turned heads. However, when launched in the early 1980s, the DeLorean was a commercial failure. It was produced by the fledgling DeLorean Motor Company, founded by John DeLorean. The car was heavily criticized by critics for its performance not matching its sporty appearance. This car had build quality issues, especially with the electrical system and the operation mechanism of the gull-wing doors. Performance was disappointing. It was considered heavy, underpowered, only using a small Peugeot Renault Volvo V6 engine, producing only about 130 horsepower, and overpriced for its actual performance. The DeLorean was a slow car with poor acceleration, unable to compete with European or American sports cars of the time. It also had many other technical problems. The DeLorean is proof of the saying, "style over substance." A great appearance couldn't compensate for poor technical quality and performance. The story of the DeLorean Motor Company also ended tragically with John DeLorean's arrest and the company's bankruptcy, although he was later acquitted. The DeLorean is still a beloved car for its cultural value, but not for being a good car. Austin Allegro, and now, position number 1, the car that often tops many lists of the worst cars, especially in the UK. That is the Austin Allegro. Launched in the early 1970s by British Leyland, the large state-owned British automotive group at the time, the Allegro was expected to be a fresh and modern design to replace the very popular Austin 1100/1300. However, it was quickly criticized for poor build quality and awkward styling. British Leyland in the 1970s was known for management problems, strikes, and poor product quality. The Allegro was a typical product of these issues. One of the most controversial and strange design features was the unusual square steering wheel in the early models. The idea was to help the driver read the instrument panel more easily, but it was very difficult to use and provided a terrible driving feel. Although it was later replaced with a round steering wheel, the image of the square steering wheel became associated with the Allegro's failure. The car was considered horrifically ugly, with unbalanced body proportions and clumsy design lines. More importantly, it had many technical problems from the engine, transmission to the suspension, frequently breaking down. Some sources described it as hideously ugly. Despite efforts to improve through Series 2 and 3, the Allegro's reputation remained tied to waste, inefficiency, low quality, and the inherent problems of British Leyland. It is considered a symbol of the issues in the British auto industry at the time, a failed product that contributed to weakening the industry's position in the global market. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoy these nostalgic stories and want to learn more about automotive history,